It's no surprise that people in Massachusetts want better transportation. Less clear is what kind of transportation matters the most and how to meet the cost. Those were among the topics in a recent public opinion survey by the MassInc polling group for the Bauer Foundation. With some thoughts on the poll results is a leading transportation advocate, the Director of Transportation for Massachusetts, Chris Dempsey. Thank you very much for being with us, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
Of course, one of the obvious things in this poll is that most people think that transportation is not getting better in this state. But I guess the other thing here that maybe matters even more is how big a priority is transportation?
What we're seeing now is that transportation is a top priority for people in Massachusetts. It's up there with education, healthcare, taxes, those really important issues. And so this is a sign that our system is not working well enough. It's holding back our economy. It's hurting our quality of life. People are fed up with it and they're ready for a change.
Chris, one of the things that makes them fed up is congestion. Congestion happens in a lot of places, but how bad is it here compared to the rest of the country, let's say?
It's really bad. So we're 7th worst in the country on congestion. Our commute times are longer than California's. So this is a real issue that's keeping people away from their families or their job or whatever it is they would rather be doing than sitting in traffic. You know, the average driver in Greater Boston wastes $1,800 every year just sitting in traffic. That's on top of what they pay for their auto insurance, for their car payment, for their gas. So this is a real economic issue and a pocketbook issue.
Unpack that a little bit. Why do they end up spending that much more money?
Well, it's a couple things. So the main thing is lost time. So lost wages at work and lost productivity. There's also increased costs of fuel, because they have to fill up more because they're wasting all of that fuel and congestion. And then the one that people don't think about is the increased cost of goods throughout society. So when you're sitting in traffic next to a Stop and Shop truck or a Star Market truck, those are trucks that have produce or have goods that you're going to buy, and the cost of those goods are higher because it takes longer to ship those goods to where you're going to buy them.
Yeah, and of course, even if you're just driving around city streets in Boston, if you're not stuck in congestion, you're driving farther to get around it, probably.
That's right. And it's not just drivers too, it's also bus riders, right? There's so many of your viewers that rely on the bus every single day, and they're sitting in that traffic. We don't do a very good job of getting those buses moving more quickly.
Before we get to the buses, one idea you have for relieving congestion on the roads is peak pricing. Explain how that would work exactly.
Sure. So this is something that a lot of regions around the country are using. More than 30 places around the country and then around the world also have this. And you can think about it kind of like an early bird special or matinee pricing for a movie. It's to give drivers a little bit of a discount or a break for driving at off-peak times. That's when we have a little bit of extra capacity in the roads. And so we should be encouraging drivers to drive at those times instead of being on the road when it's really bad in those rush hour cycles. So we're proposing that MassDOT do a discount program of some kind where they give drivers a break to maybe go through the tunnels towards East Boston if they do it off-peak.
And I guess one of the things here that the experts say is that even if you reduce that peak load slightly, that can make a big difference.
Yes, that's the beauty of it. So because traffic is what they call a nonlinear function, it means that getting a relatively small number of cars off the road, maybe 5% of cars, can actually give you a big reduction in traffic, maybe 20%. So we don't need everyone to get off the road at rush hour. We just need, 1 out of 20 cars to get off the road, and that's going to make everyone better off.
This is BNN News. We're talking with Chris Dempsey from Transportation from Massachusetts. Chris, getting back to the congestion faced by people on buses, what can be done about that?
There's a couple different options here, but one that's really important is to give buses their own space on the road. Buses move a lot of people. There are roads in Greater Boston where 50% of the people traveling on that road are traveling in a bus, and the bus vehicle itself is only taking up 2% of the space on the road. If we did a better job of allocating that space, we'd move more people. And that's really the goal of a thriving city like Boston, is how do you move people? We need to move beyond the concept that everyone's going to be in their own individual vehicle and instead say, how do we get these really productive workers to where they want to go, whether they're going to work or whether they're going to be shopping or going to an appointment at a healthcare facility. And so dedicated space is one big thing. Another thing is what's called signal prioritization. And that's basically making our traffic lights smart enough to know when there's a transit vehicle, like even the green line that goes right past your office, to have that vehicle talk to the traffic light and give it an extra green or a slightly longer ability to get through that intersection to move those people that are in that trolley.
And talk about the kind of delays. I was on a Silver Line bus once. It took me, I think, about 15 minutes to go from Cass Boulevard to Dudley Square. I mean, that's eons, isn't it?
Here's a good example of that. The 111 bus, which is the sixth busiest bus in the entire MBTA system, it goes over the Tobin Bridge from Chelsea to Haymarket. That bus can sometimes take 45 or 50 minutes to go that trip. That's a 2.7 mile trip. So it's going less than 5 miles per hour on that trip. And that's very typical, unfortunately, for that bus.
Now, there are some other cities who've done more of this so far than we have, and we've done a little bit of it here in Boston, but does this really make much of a difference one way or another?
It really does. So what cities are seeing is that the most cost-effective way to move people is to get their buses moving faster. So we really need to be focused on that as a region. If we want to have a productive economy and not have everyone stuck in traffic all the time, we have to be more efficient. We're not going to get that just through new revenue for the system, although that's an important part of it too. It's also about using what we have more efficiently. That's something that the governor talks a lot about, it's something the mayor talks a lot about, and it's something that advocates are now echoing too.
Well, transportation talk these days is increasingly multimodal, and that includes sidewalks. The city recently figured out that we have some sidewalk inequality. I mean, what's the issue here? Is there more to this than just curb appeal?
Yeah, it's unfortunate that the city has a history of investing more in some sidewalks in certain neighborhoods than in other neighborhoods. But I have to give the city a lot of credit here for being willing to undertake this study and understand that this is an issue and pledging that they're going to make a difference here. We have to give Mayor Walsh a lot of credit for that. He now understands that it's not just about having pretty sidewalks in the Back Bay or Beacon Hill, it's also about having them in Roxbury and Dorchester and Hyde Park and every neighborhood throughout the city. He's made a real commitment to that, and we really applaud that.
Another thing here, too, speaking of multimodal, Governor Baker committing to funding for complete streets. Mm-hmm. For viewers who don't know what that term means, explain what that means and why the governor's support is so important.
Complete Streets is about making sure that we use our streets to get as many people through those streets as possible, as safely as possible, and then we also make sure that our streets are a platform for economic development. If you're a business along a street, you want to make sure that that's a healthy and safe place to be. So it's about rethinking the old paradigm that streets are about moving as many vehicles as possible, and instead saying, are there smarter ways for us to get people to be attracted to this street and to move on this street? It's things like bike lanes, it's things like dedicated bus lanes, it's things like rethinking parking, which the city is also doing. So this is a real movement that's happening not just around the country, but especially here in Greater Boston, and we're lucky that people are now thinking that way.
Now, there's another transportation idea that did not originate with your group. It's getting under a lot of people's skins these days, about the gondolas between South Station and the Seaport District. What about that?
Well, I think people are attracted to ideas like that because they're so sick and tired of the congestion. But what we would say is it's better to fix the congestion that we have, solve the problem on the road, rather than building an expensive system to fly over the congestion that doesn't actually solve the problem on the ground. And so it's things like complete streets and bus lanes and supporting biking and walking that are really going to help us solve that congestion problem and make our city thrive, not just kind of building something over top.
I want to circle back to public attitudes about paying for this, because I was at the victory party when Charlie Baker was elected, and prior to that, I saw how many people were cheering when the gas tax was rolled back. People like that going to pay for peak pricing to relieve congestion, you think?
Yeah, so look, I think people understand that when you want to invest in the system, you're going to need revenue to do that, and they just want to make sure that that money is used efficiently. What we saw in the polling as an example of this is that when you do a discount for off-peak, it has 60% support. Another good data point is that above 50% of voters support all electronic tolling on their road as long as they're sure that the revenue dedicated from that toll is going to be invested on the road they're driving on. And that's a fair deal for people to say, look, if you're going to pay into the system, we want you to see an obvious and immediate benefit from it. That's how we need to be talking about these things.
And of course, the big private sector solution that we were promised a few years back was that ride sharing would provide enormous relief. They're replacing taxis, but where do we stand with this?
Yeah, so ride sharing is an important part of the equation. And look, I use ride sharing once in a while, as do a lot of people, but it's not going to solve our transportation issues. Unfortunately, there's some evidence that it's actually made congestion worse in the city. But rather than ban it, rather than say, well, we should limit that in some way, what we need to do is get back to these questions about complete streets and how do we efficiently use our road system. Uber and Lyft can be great because they can support a lifestyle where someone doesn't have to own a car and they can take the T most of the time and then use an Uber and Lyft when they need to. But obviously, we don't want a system where people are just taking Uber and Lyft all the time because it's going to create way more traffic on the streets than we already have today. So this is going to be fixed with smarter policy, with us understanding that we have to allocate the road space better, not by banning Uber and Lyft.
I want to ask you about one data point I'm sure you've seen, is the number of Uber and Lyft drivers in New York City compared to the number of taxi drivers. I mean, talk about that. What does that mean?
Well, that's a fascinating topic. I think for many years we actually had too few taxis in Greater Boston. As someone that used to go out at the city and at 1 or 2 in the morning, it was impossible to get home because the T was shut down and there weren't enough taxis on the street. So Uber and Lyft have helped solve that problem by providing more supply. The problem is that those drivers are now circling around the block and trying to wait for a pickup, pulling over in a bike lane, just like a delivery truck, used to do. And so that's really creating some of this congestion that we have. And we're going to need to think smarter if we're going to want to reduce that. That includes more investment in public transportation so that people see that as a viable alternative to Uber and Lyft.
Well, I got to commend you always at least posting these new ideas and the insights. So you've got a website people can check out, and you got a Twitter feed too, right?
Yeah, so t4ma.org. So T, the number 4ma.org. And the Twitter handle is T4MASS.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Chris.
Chris Dempsey from Transportation for Massachusetts.